Alright, now let's talk about why it sucked to be a medieval assassin. The life of an average medieval assassin started off pretty similarly to that of most other medieval people. They were born into poverty or some kind of maybe their family was poor or they had been exiled from their community for one reason or another. For instance, sometimes an assassin would need to scale the walls of a building while carrying heavy equipment. While a lot of people think that assassins kill their targets, only about 25% of hits during the Middle Ages resulted in death. Professional assassins operated in guilds, much like the merchants' guilds that existed throughout Europe during the Middle Ages. These guilds provided assassins with training, resources, and protection, and regulated the profession of killing. And this wasn't unique to assassins either. During the Middle Ages, almost every occupation had its own guild, and assassins often found themselves on the run from not only the law, but also from the families of their victims. While commoners could hire assassins to kill people they had beef with, members of the nobility were more likely to hire assassins for political purposes. For example, King Louis XI of France employed a group of assassins to eliminate his enemies. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe and leave a comment below. And as always, thanks for watching. The king's personal bodyguard was even killed by one of these assassins. After he refused to participate in the plot, despite the danger, many assassins continued to ply their trade, and some even became quite wealthy. Just like today, assassins during the Middle Ages sometimes missed their targets. Sometimes the target was well protected. Other times the assassin simply wasn't up to the task. But when an assassination attempt failed, the consequences could be severe. The would-be assassin might be put on trial for attempted murder, while the target could retaliate and hire someone to kill the assassin. After all, when you're good at what you do and there's always a steady supply of people willing to pay you to kill others, the job security is pretty good. The Baker's Guild, for example, set the price for bread and regulated its quality, and members of the Barber Surgeons Guild were trained to treat wounds and even perform surgeries. More often than not, assassins would need to dispose of a still living, possibly wounded target, along with the evidence that would implicate them in the crime. But this meant that they were frequently on the road and had to travel long distances to carry out their contracts. Luckily for them, Europe during the Middle Ages had an extensive network of roads and bridges that connected major cities, and inns were often available for travelers to rest their heads. Still though, this didn't mean that assassins didn't run into trouble. One of the most famous assassins during the Middle Ages was an Italian hitman named Matteo, who was hired to kill a fellow Italian in France. After he did the deed, he tried to escape over the Alps, but was captured by local authorities and executed. As such, many assassins were given training in surgery, so that they knew how to quickly move a still-living target to a safe house. Swords and daggers were, of course, popular weapons among assassins, but they also used bows and arrows, firearms, and even poison. Poison was especially popular because it was a discreet way to kill someone, and many assassins kept several poisonous substances on hand. One of the most infamous poisons during the Middle Ages was called the inheritance of the two sisters. It was a slow-acting poison that caused its victims to appear as if they had died of natural causes. Even worse, in the late Middle Ages, assassins began to use firearms. And unlike swords or daggers, a gun made a lot of noise when it was fired, so the assassin had to make sure that they were far away from the scene of the crime when the shot was heard. And then, of course, they had to wait until morning to come back and collect the body, so that they could properly dispose of it. Because of all of these added steps, being an assassin during the Middle Ages was extremely high stakes, requiring skill, planning, and knowledge, and they had to be careful not only for their own safety, but also for the safety of everyone around them. So before beginning their mission, they would spend weeks scaling the walls of the guild building. Other times they would need to make their way through a castle or a heavily guarded home, so they would spend their time studying the blueprints and planning out the best route to take. Many assassins also received training in multiple methods of fighting, meaning that they needed to be able to defend themselves against swords, maces, daggers, and even guns. Additionally, assassins often had to be familiar with how different weapons looked, so that they could take advantage of any opportunity that presented itself. One of the most important tools in the assassin's arsenal was disguise. A skilled assassin was someone who could blend into any crowd and look convincingly male, female, young, old, or anything in between. In order to help them with this, many assassins chose to dress as beggars, since no one really pays attention to what a beggar looks like. It was also easier to carry a dagger under a beggaress cloak than it was to conceal it under fine clothing. Because of this, many assassins would start out their missions by robbing a beggar, taking their disguise and then using it to infiltrate their target's home. They may have also just been plain old orphans. And in the medieval period, there were only two options for poor, disenfranchised people. The first option was to beg for scraps of food and sleep wherever they could find shelter. Or the second option was to become a trained professional within the guilds, which were sort of like unions, learning a trade and hopefully working their way out of poverty. This is exactly what happened with many of the early assassins. They joined up with a guild of assassins and slowly began making a living doing the dirtiest work, such as cleaning, latrines, carrying dead bodies away from crime scenes, and even sometimes selling the bodies to surgeons who wanted to practice their craft. But eventually, as they worked for the guild, they got good at their job, Eventually, they became familiar with every nook and cranny of the city, knowing the best places to hide bodies and how to sneak around without being seen. And this is when they were finally allowed to join the top level of the Assassins Guild, becoming full-fledged professional assassins. In reality, assassins during the Middle Ages were not very different from hitmen today. They would meet with a wealthy patron, usually a member of the nobility or higher, and discuss who their target was and how they wanted them dealt with. Usually, though, death was not the goal, but rather maiming or disfigurement. The best example of this was from a story about a man named Bartolomeo who was sent by his Genoese employers to kill a rival merchant. He did not do this by stabbing him or shooting him, but instead by throwing acid in his face. Not only was this much more discreet, but it also ensured that the victim would live a life of shame and agony after having their entire face eaten away by the chemicals. It should be noted, though, that poisoning was also a very common way for assassins to carry out their contracts. In fact, in the late Middle Ages, there was even such a high demand for poisons that apothecaries began to stock up on the most popular ones, including aqua tofana, a tasteless poison that could easily be put into any food or drink. So if someone ate something and immediately began convulsing, foaming at the mouth, and then died shortly thereafter, chances are it was the chef who had poisoned them after receiving payment from someone else. Now, we don't know exactly who these chefs were paid by or why they were doing this, but one theory suggests that many times it was actually the wife of the person eating the food who was behind the contract. While those were certainly some easy ways to get rid of someone, other contracts called for a bit more finesse, which is where the training of the assassin came in. But probably the hardest part of being an assassin was dealing with the aftermath of the hit. So now let's move on to some fun facts about the medieval assassins. No. 1. Assassins were organized. No. 2. Assassins were well-traveled. Because assassins needed to be familiar with the cities that they operated in, they were often hired locally. No. 3. Assassins used a variety of weapons. Number 4. Being an assassin was dangerous. As you can imagine, when your job is to kill people, you're bound to make enemies. And now, speaking of steady job security, let's move on to fact number 5. Assassins were often employed by kings and queens. And finally, let's move on to number 6. Assassination attempts weren't always successful. Thank you for watching.